They called it the Atlantic Lifeline. But in truth, it was a death route, one where over 70,000 men vanished without graves. For 6 years, an invisible war raged beneath the waves, fought by men who never saw their enemies and rarely saw daylight. This was not a battle for territory. It was a battle for survival, waged in total darkness. In 1939, as war ignited across Europe, Admiral Karl Dönitz looked to these machines, the U-boats, as the blade that would bleed Britain dry. He envisioned a war won not through vast fleets or towering battleships, but through stealth, precision, and fear. With only 57 operational submarines, he believed a handful of gray wolves could stalk convoys and choke the island nation's lifelines. At first, his prophecy seemed unstoppable. The Type 7 U-boat became the terror of the Atlantic, fast, to dive small enough to hide, yet armed with torpedoes that could rip through a ship's hull in seconds. In the early months of 1940, merchant ships burned across every horizon. Britain lost more than 1 million tons of shipping in a single year. Cargo vessels carrying wheat, oil, and munitions erupted into pillars of fire. The night sea shimmered with flame. Each sinking pushed Britain closer to starvation, forcing Churchill to confess privately that the U-boat peril was the one thing that truly frightened him. But beneath Germany's triumph lurked overconfidence. The Kriegsmarine boasted that it had mastered the ocean, that no convoy could pass unseen. Dönitz called his captains Knights of the Deep, bound by discipline and daring. Yet every victory drew the Allies deeper into innovation. The Atlantic was not a conquered sea. It was a living adversary, vast and unpredictable. The question soon haunted every Allied admiral and scientist alike. How do you hunt what you cannot see? Britain's empire was built on trade, and in war that trade became its lifeline. Every loaf of bread, every gallon of fuel, every rifle cartridge had to cross an ocean patrolled by unseen predators. By 1941, more than 3,000 merchant ships were weaving across the Atlantic, escorted by thin screens of destroyers and corvettes. Each convoy was a moving city, spread across miles of storm-tossed water. To lose it meant hunger, defeat, or surrender. The Royal Navy fought to adapt. Radar was primitive, unreliable in heavy seas. Sonar, then called ASDIC, sent sound pulses into the depths, but the ocean returned only confusion. Ice whales' wrecks all sounded like the enemy. The U-boats exploited this blindness. At night they surfaced, diesel engines roaring, and attacked with precision. One of Dönitz's most celebrated commanders, Günther Prien, slipped U-47 through British defenses and into Scapa Flow, the Royal Navy's supposedly impregnable anchorage. In the darkness, he fired his torpedoes and sank the battleship Royal Oak with 700 men aboard. The explosion echoed across the empire. For Dönitz, this was proof that small, unseen hunters could humble the world's mightiest fleet. Nazi propaganda turned his captains into heroes, their portraits printed beside slogans of destiny and vengeance. Yet even as the Atlantic bled, the Allies hardened. Canada's shipyards mass-produced escort vessels. Iceland became an Allied fortress, closing the mid-ocean gap. Air patrols extended farther west each month. The convoys grew tighter, their defenses sharper. The struggle became one of endurance, steel against saltwater, code against code, machine against mind. In a quiet estate at Bletchley Park, far from the sound of the waves, a new kind of weapon was being forged, not of metal but of mathematics. Behind the ivy-covered walls of Bletchley Park, hundreds of men and women labored in silence. Their enemy was invisible, their battlefield made of numbers. Every U-boat in the Atlantic relied on the Enigma machine, a compact cipher device whose shifting rotors produced trillions of possible combinations. Each morning, Dönitz's command transmitted orders in coded bursts of radio static. Each night, Allied convoys vanished beneath torpedoes whose origins no one could trace. The key to the Atlantic War lay not in the sea but in the pattern of those signals. Early in 1941, fortune struck. British destroyers captured U-110 after a surface battle and found within it a functioning Enigma and its codebooks. Combined with Polish research and Alan Turing's new bomb computers, the Allies unlocked what had seemed unbreakable. The intelligence that followed was codenamed Ultra. Suddenly the Allies could read German orders, predict wolfpack movements, and divert convoys before the hunters arrived. Ships once doomed began arriving safely in port, but victory came at a price. If the Germans discovered the breach, they would alter Enigma and seal it again. To protect the secret, Allied commanders sometimes watched convoys sail into known ambushes, sacrificing ships to preserve Ultra. It was a grim arithmetic, lives traded for longer survival. Still, knowledge tipped the scales. The Atlantic grew less haunted, the wolves less certain of their prey, yet Dönitz was not beaten. He expanded production, refining tactics and weaponry. New U-boats slipped from their pens every week. He believed he could flood the ocean faster than the Allies could defend it. For a time, he was right, and the Atlantic once again erupted in flame. Night falls, February 1943. Storms lash the convoy on 166 as 30 U-boats converge like shadows drawn to blood. The wolfpacks are at their peak. Guided by encrypted radio, Dönitz's submarines move in coordinated formations stretching across hundreds of miles. Each U-boat carries a crew of 40, trained to the second, ready to attack the moment their commander gives the order. Above them, merchant ships crawl through sleet and darkness, slow, blind, perfect targets. The assault begins. Torpedoes streak through black water, exploding beneath tankers and freighters. Flames leap skyward, lighting the waves like liquid fire. Men scramble across tilting decks, lifeboats splinter, voices vanish beneath the wind. For 6 nights, convoys SC-122 and HX-229 endure relentless attack. 22 ships vanish into the deep. The sea becomes a graveyard of oil and wreckage. Berlin celebrates another victory. German radio declares the Atlantic a sea of British tears. Dönitz proclaims that the tonnage war is turning in Germany's favor. But what he cannot see are the invisible ripples of his own transmissions. Every message coordinating his wolves is being triangulated by Allied high-frequency direction finding, Huff-Duff. Each coded signal gives away a position. Each position draws destroyers closer. The hunters are being mapped even as they kill. Allied escort groups grow ruthless, depth charges saturating the water. Captain Frederick Walker's famed hunter-killer group perfects the art of pursuit: circle, pin, destroy. The North Atlantic, once a playground of predators, becomes a killing ground for both sides. By spring 1943, the tide is shifting. The U-boats still fight with courage and skill, but the ocean is no longer theirs alone. The sky itself is beginning to change, and with it will come a new enemy, one that sees farther than any periscope ever could. The sky, once a distant observer of the Atlantic War, became its new battlefield. The air war at sea began as a desperate measure, a patchwork of long-range patrols, outdated aircraft, and fleeting sightings. Yet by 1943, it had transformed into the decisive weapon that would strangle Germany's U-boat campaign. The vast gray ocean, once the wolfpack's sanctuary, was now being watched from above. The breakthrough came with endurance. American B-24 Liberators, British Sunderlands, and Catalina flying boats began patrolling hundreds of miles beyond previous limits. With radar domes mounted beneath their bellies, they pierced the fog and darkness. Even the ocean's surface, once an impenetrable mirror, betrayed the faint glimmer of a periscope or wake. At night, when U-boats surfaced to recharge their batteries, the Allies unleashed the Lee Light, a powerful searchlight that snapped on mid-dive, flooding the ocean with blinding brilliance. In that moment of exposure, the hunter froze, caught between the stars and the sea seconds before the first depth charge fell. No longer did daylight promise safety. No longer could darkness conceal. By the summer of 1943, squadrons operating from Iceland, Newfoundland, and West Africa closed the mid-Atlantic Black Pit. Even the once invincible Bay of Biscay, gateway to Germany's submarine bases, became a death trap. The air hummed with engines, the sea boiled with explosions. For the men inside those submarines, existence narrowed to fear and endurance. The Atlantic grew claustrophobic. Inside the steel hulls, temperatures soared, oxygen thinned, and the stench of oil, sweat, and machinery became a constant companion. Every ping of sonar was a prelude to terror, an invisible countdown to death. Men whispered prayers as depth charges thundered around them, shaking bolts loose, extinguishing lights, and cracking hull plates. In May alone, 41 U-boats were destroyed, more than in any previous month. For Dönitz, it was a breaking point. He ordered a temporary withdrawal, conceding that the Atlantic War had turned against Germany. The wolfpacks were dying faster than they could be replaced. Yet even in retreat, he refused to surrender his faith in technology. Deep within Germany's bombed shipyards, engineers were already sketching designs for something new, sleeker, faster, unstoppable. A final miracle weapon that might turn defeat into resurrection. By 1944, the once mighty U-boat arm had become a shadow of its former self. The oceans were now Allied territory, dominated by radar, aircraft, and convoy systems that functioned like a living network. But in the ruins of German shipyards, hope flickered in blueprints and prototypes. The Kriegsmarine's last gamble would not rely on numbers but on revolution. Engineers were tasked with creating a submarine that could remain underwater indefinitely, a machine no longer bound by the need to surface and expose itself to death from above. The result was the Type WWII Electroboot, and its smaller sibling, the Type WWII. Sleek, hydrodynamic, and far ahead of their time, these submarines promised to restore the edge once held by the first wolfpacks. They featured massive battery arrays, advanced snorkels for drawing air while submerged, and silent running motors that baffled Allied sonar. On paper, they were perfect. The Type WWII could travel submerged at 17 knots, faster underwater than most surface ships could chase. But perfection on paper could not outrun destruction from the sky. Allied bombers pounded Kiel, Hamburg, and Bremen, where the new U-boats were assembled. Production lines shattered under 1,000-bomber raids. Components arrived late or not at all. Crews trained in flooded basins rather than open seas, learning theory without practice. Every day lost to bombing was another convoy that reached Britain unscathed. Still, the dream refused to die. In April 1945, with Germany collapsing, one of the few completed Type WWII boats, U-2511, slipped from its pen under the command of Captain Adalbert Schnee, a veteran of earlier triumphs. As it glided silently through the Norwegian Sea, Schnee's crew detected a British cruiser. The old instincts stirred. He could have attacked, could have proven that the new generation of submarines still held power. But the order from Dönitz was clear: cease all hostilities. Schnee disengaged, diving deep and heading home to surrender. The Phantom fleet had arrived too late. The war it was meant to win had already ended. The once feared U-boat arm now faced extinction. The engineer's genius had given birth to ghosts, vessels without purpose in a world already claimed by defeat. The war in Europe ended not with a roar but with a surrendering whisper beneath the waves. By May 1945, the Atlantic was littered with wreckage. Over 780 U-boats destroyed, their twisted remains scattered across the seabed. The rest sat idle in pens and fjords, their crews waiting for orders that would determine whether they lived or died. When Hitler took his own life in April, command passed to Admiral Dönitz, who ruled over a crumbling Reich for mere days. His final directive was both practical and symbolic. He could not allow Germany's revolutionary submarines to fall into Allied hands. Thus was born Operation Regenbogen, the Rainbow Order. Every U-boat was to be scuttled by its own crew. Across harbors from Norway to France, sailors opened flood valves and set demolition charges, watching as their steel homes filled with seawater and sank. For some, it was an act of pride. For others, despair. Of the 1,156 U-boats built during the war, only 30 would survive to surrender. The rest disappeared into the cold depths. The men who crewed them, young, devoted, and often barely trained, had endured horrors beyond imagination. Depth charges exploding like thunder, air thick with carbon dioxide, and the constant awareness that a single crack in the hull meant instant death. Each patrol was a roll of dice against the ocean itself. Those who survived emerged pale, trembling, and hollow-eyed. Many never adjusted to life on land again. They had been trapped too long in the steel womb of war, and peace felt alien. For the Kriegsmarine, the U-boat campaign ended not with victory but with annihilation, one of the highest casualty rates in any branch of service in human history. 3 out of every 4 submariners never returned. The final dives marked more than defeat. They marked the death of an idea, the belief that individual courage and engineering brilliance could overcome an entire world united in resistance. The Atlantic had swallowed that myth whole, leaving only silence in its wake. Decades later, the ghosts of the U-boats remain. Resting on the ocean floor, their rusting hulls stretch across the seabed like a vast graveyard, silent monuments to ambition, innovation, and loss. The Battle of the Atlantic, the longest continuous campaign of World War II, lasted nearly 6 years. It claimed over 70,000 Allied sailors and merchant seamen, and more than 30,000 German submariners, 3/4 of those who served beneath the waves. From defeat rose transformation. The lessons learned from those years reshaped every navy on Earth. Submarine warfare, once defined by isolation, evolved into a system of cooperation, of intelligence sharing, sonar webs, and joint command between air and sea. The triumph of Allied coordination proved that survival in modern warfare depended not on brilliance alone, but on adaptation and unity. Technology could create advantage, but only strategy could sustain it. For Germany, the war beneath the sea became a study in paradox. The U-boats had nearly starved Britain into submission, yet in doing so, they had provoked the innovation that would destroy them. Every radar upgrade, every codebreakers breakthrough, every aircraft patrol was born of necessity forged by terror. By 1944, the hunter had become the hunted, and the Atlantic, once the stage of domination, became the grave of its masters. Today, sonar still pings through those cold waters. Divers descend into the wrecks, shining lights across rusted hulls where names and numbers still cling to steel. The ocean holds its silence, keeping the final secrets of the men who vanished into its depths. Their sacrifice stands as both warning and testament. Power without foresight is a tide that turns against its maker. Even now, the echoes of the Atlantic War murmur beneath the waves, a quiet reminder that even the hunter can drown in the silence of his own making.